In February 1945, as Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner's amphibious task force approached the volcanic shores of Iwo Jima, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi stood inside Mount Suribachi's command bunker, 7 stories beneath solid rock. He was confident that his engineering masterpiece would withstand anything the American fleet could deliver. His 21,000 troops occupied 11 miles of interconnected tunnels and 1,500 rooms carved from volcanic stone. Pillboxes had walls 5 feet thick, reinforced with steel rails brought from Tokyo. Gun emplacements sat behind layered concrete, designed to absorb direct hits from 14-inch naval shells based on calculations by Japanese naval architects. Kuribayashi had studied American amphibious doctrine at Tarawa and Saipan. He observed preliminary bombardments lasting 2 to 3 days. He designed his defenses accordingly. He embedded artillery in caves with interlocking fields of fire, positioned machine gun nests in defilade and invisible from the sea, and built mortar pits with overhead cover that could survive everything except a direct penetration by the heaviest ordnance. What he failed to anticipate was the evolution of American naval gunnery doctrine. The overwhelming volume of explosives, 7 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, and 12 destroyers could maintain over 74 consecutive hours, and the devastating accuracy of radar fire control coupled with spotter aircraft. This combination transformed naval bombardment from area saturation into surgical precision, capable of collapsing even his deepest fortifications. The Imperial Japanese Army built its defensive philosophy on concrete confidence, forged by brutal lessons across the Central Pacific. At Tarawa in November 1943, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki's 4,836 troops held coconut log and concrete fortifications against a bombardment that delivered 3,000 tons of shells in 3 hours. They inflicted 3,400 American casualties during the 3-day battle because most defensive positions survived the preliminary fire. Japanese analysts studied the engagement obsessively. They concluded that layered defenses with reinforced concrete, deep underground positions, and camouflaged emplacements could absorb the punishment the United States Navy typically allocated for pre-invasion bombardment. Peleliu in September 1944 seemed to validate this view. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa's cave defenses in the Umur-Brogol ridges withstood 3 days of naval gunfire from 5 battleships and multiple cruisers. The result was a grinding 2-month battle that cost 10,000 American casualties against a garrison of 11,000 Japanese troops. The pattern appeared consistent. American doctrine favored brief, intense bombardments of 2 to 4 days before amphibious assault, prioritizing surprise and momentum over thorough destruction of hardened fortifications. Japanese engineers exploited this predictability. They calculated that concrete walls thicker than 4 feet with similar overhead cover could survive near misses from 14-inch shells, while positions deeper than 50 feet underground were virtually invulnerable to anything except sustained, precisely targeted fire that American gunnery practice seemed unable to deliver consistently. Kuribayashi's Iwo Jima defenses represented the culmination of this evolution. They incorporated lessons from every previous battle into what Japanese planners considered an impregnable system capable of inflicting prohibitive casualties, regardless of preliminary bombardment duration. The Imperial Navy's experience reinforced confidence in concrete. During the bombardment of shore installations at Truk Lagoon in February 1944, American task forces expended thousands of shells against Japanese coastal batteries and supply facilities. Many hardened positions remained operational until bypassed by Allied strategy, rather than destroyed by naval gunfire. Japanese naval architects calculated that American battleship shells, while formidable, followed ballistic trajectories that limited effectiveness against deeply buried or reverse-slope positions. They judged dispersion patterns over extended ranges meant most shells would land within 100 yards of aim points, but rarely achieve the direct hits needed to collapse heavily reinforced structures. These conclusions relied on peacetime tests where Japanese engineers bombarded concrete bunkers with their own battleship guns. They determined that positions with 5 feet of reinforced concrete overhead and similar wall thickness could withstand everything except sustained fire from the heaviest 16-inch guns at ranges closer than 10,000 yards. They believed American doctrine would rarely accept such exposure. Kuribayashi's confidence rested on systematic analysis of American patterns, engineering calculations validated by previous engagements, and the mass of concrete and volcanic rock protecting his garrison. American naval doctrine had evolved through hard lessons purchased with Marine casualties at Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner and Marine Lieutenant General Holland Smith, commanding V Amphibious Corps, recognized that inadequate preliminary bombardment translated directly into casualties on the beaches. They demanded changes that revolutionized naval fire support. The transformation began with fire control technology. By 1945, American battleships mounted Mark 8 fire control radar that tracked shells in flight and adjusted fire with precision unimaginable 3 years earlier. Mark 13 fire control systems computed solutions that incorporated wind drift, the Earth's rotation, barrel wear, and propellant temperature. They placed shells within 50-yard circles at ranges beyond 20,000 yards. Spotter aircraft, primarily OS-2U Kingfisher floatplanes, launched from battleship catapults and Marine F-4U Corsairs, coordinating with naval gunfire liaison officers, provided real-time assessment and correction. Naval gunfire shifted from blind barrage to an iterative process. Observers directed repeated salvos against specific targets until visual confirmation of destruction. Most importantly, American industry produced ammunition in quantities that made sustained bombardment logistically feasible. The 7 battleships assigned to Iwo Jima carried an average of 1,200 rounds of 14-inch or 16-inch ammunition each. Regular replenishment from ammunition ships sustained days of fire missions without degrading readiness for a potential Japanese counterattack. USS Nevada, resurrected from the mud of Pearl Harbor after Japanese bombs sank her on December 7, 1941, exemplified this transformation. Modernized with advanced fire control, her 10 14-inch guns could deliver 1,500-pound armor-piercing shells, or 1,275-pound high-capacity bombardment rounds to targets 23,000 yards distant. Accuracy was measured in tens of yards, not hundreds. Her crew trained extensively in shore bombardment at Kahulawe Island, Hawaii. They fired thousands of practice rounds at concrete bunkers built to simulate Japanese fortifications. They developed techniques for plunging fire that maximized penetration against overhead cover and sustained firing sequences that collapsed heavily reinforced positions through cumulative damage. USS Idaho and USS Tennessee, with 12 14-inch guns each, brought similar capabilities. USS New York, despite her older design with 10 14-inch guns, carried experienced crews who had supported landings in the Mediterranean and the Pacific. The true heavy artillery came from the 16-inch battleships USS Washington and USS North Carolina. Each mounted 9 rifles capable of hurling 2,700-pound armor-piercing shells, or 1,900-pound high-capacity rounds, with explosive fillers, exceeding 150 pounds of explosive D, which was more powerful than standard TNT. These weapons represented the apex of naval artillery. They could penetrate 16 inches of vertical armor at 20,000 yards and defeat virtually any overhead cover through kinetic energy and blast. On February 16, 1945, 3 days before D-Day for Operation Detachment, the bombardment of Iwo Jima began under gray Pacific skies. USS Tennessee opened fire at 8 a.m. from 16,000 yards offshore. Her 12 14-inch guns targeted the southern beaches where Marines would land. The first salvo of 6 shells arced through the cold morning air. Trajectories approached 45 degrees, which maximized penetration against horizontal surfaces. Each 1,500-pound projectile struck with kinetic energy exceeding 50 million foot-pounds. That force was like a freight locomotive traveling 100 miles per hour, concentrated into an impact area measured in square inches. The shells penetrated beach sand and detonated 4 to 6 feet deep. Explosions excavated craters 15 feet across and 8 feet deep. They hurled volcanic ash and pulverized rock hundreds of feet skyward, For Japanese troops observing from Mount Suribachi and the northern highlands, the bombardment initially looked familiar. It was dramatic and terrifying, yet survivable inside hardened positions. Lieutenant Toshihiko Ono, commanding a 47mm anti-tank gun position encased in 5 feet of reinforced concrete on Suribachi's eastern slope, reported that near misses from multiple large-caliber shells caused only dust and minor spalling. That result matched defensive doctrine. Japanese observers missed a critical fact in those first hours. The American fire plan was systematic and would last far longer than before. Unlike earlier operations that focused on area targets before shifting to support landing forces, the Iwo Jima plan assigned specific targets to individual ships. Crews were told to continue engaging until spotters confirmed destruction or until they reached ammunition limits. USS Nevada received Mount Suribachi's western face. Intelligence identified at least 40 separate positions from aerial photography and submarine periscope observations. Nevada's fire control team worked with spotters from Marine Observation Squadron 4, flying low over the slopes. They began methodical destruction. They placed 3 shell salvos on specific coordinates. They waited for assessment. They repeated fire with adjusted aim points until observers confirmed each position neutralized. This iterative approach meant some emplacements received 10 or more direct salvos over hours. Their concrete structures suffered cumulative damage that exceeded any engineering calculation based on single-hit survival. Sustained bombardment physics exposed vulnerabilities in reinforced concrete. A single 14-inch shell, detonating against 5 feet of reinforced concrete, might not penetrate completely. It could create a 2-foot crater, with extensive cracking radiating from the impact. A second shell landing within 10 feet of the first found concrete already compromised. It achieved deeper penetration and extended cracks through load-bearing members. A third, fourth, and fifth shell turned hairline cracks into structural fissures, spalled protective layers, exposed reinforcing steel to blast, bent and twisted the metal framework, and ultimately collapsed the position in a progressive failure cascade. Kuribayashi observed this pattern, destroying defenses throughout February 16th and 17th. Positions he had personally inspected and approved disappeared under sustained American fire that did not shift targets until spotters confirmed destruction. By the end of the second day, communications with forward units showed a disturbing pattern. Positions reported minimal early damage, but fell silent after hours of continuous targeting. Reinforced concrete structures were pulverized into rubble, despite meeting every engineering specification based on previous battles. The bombardment intensified on February 17th as American fire control teams refined techniques and additional ships joined. USS Washington, a fast battleship with 9 16-inch guns designed for fleet engagements, brought her main battery against the northern highlands, where Japanese artillery commanded the beach approaches. Each 16-inch Mark 6 gun fired 2,700-pound armor-piercing shells with 40 pounds of explosive filler or 1,900-pound Mark 13 high-capacity shells containing 153.6 pounds of explosive D for fortified targets. The kinetic energy exceeded 100 million foot-pounds at impact, more than double that of 14-inch shells. Penetration could defeat 18 inches of vertical armor or burrow through 20 feet of earth and concrete before detonation. When Washington's first 16-inch salvo struck a Japanese position on Hill 382, the impact produced seismic shocks detected by instruments offshore. The explosion ejected a 75mm gun barrel that somersaulted through the air and crashed 200 yards away. Japanese defenders had never faced bombardment of this scale, duration, or precision. Major Yoshitaka Hori, commanding supply operations from nearby Chichijima, received increasingly desperate radio traffic from Kuribayashi's headquarters. Reports described systematic destruction of positions previously considered invulnerable. A coastal defense gun on the western beaches sat behind 8 feet of reinforced concrete in a natural cave that added rock cover equivalent to 15 feet of overhead protection. It survived the first day with superficial damage, but sustained fire from USS Idaho on February 17th, more than 100 rounds of 14-inch ammunition over 6 hours, progressively collapsed the entrance. Repeated impacts in the same spot penetrated the overhead cover. A later round detonated inside the emplacement, killing the crew and rendering the position permanently inoperable. Similar reports arrived throughout the second and third days. Pillboxes designed to withstand direct hits collapsed after hours of sustained fire. Interconnected tunnels became inaccessible due to cave-ins triggered by near misses that fractured volcanic rock. Carefully camouflaged gun positions were systematically targeted and destroyed after spotters identified them through muzzle flashes or observed foot traffic patterns. The scale of explosives delivered against Iwo Jima's 8 square miles exceeded anything attempted before an amphibious warfare. Over 74 hours from February 16th through February 19th, 7 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, and 12 destroyers expended approximately 38,000 shells, totaling more than 14,000 tons of explosives. For context, Tarawa's preliminary bombardment delivered 3,000 tons over 3 hours. Saipan received approximately 5,000 tons over 2 days. Peleliu received approximately 4,500 tons over 3 days. Iwo Jima received nearly triple the explosive tonnage of any previous operation, sustained without interruption, with coordinated fire that overlapped coverage across the entire defensive network. USS Tennessee alone fired more than 1,300 rounds of 14-inch ammunition, effectively emptying her magazines twice through at-sea replenishment. Her crew maintained firing rates approaching 1 round per gun every 3 minutes for extended periods. The sustained tempo tested machinery and human endurance. It demonstrated the reliability of American naval artillery and the proficiency of trained crews. This industrial-scale firepower forced Japanese defenders to confront a new reality. American logistics could sustain bombardment indefinitely. Precision fire control made every shell potentially decisive. The cumulative force of thousands of large-caliber explosions reshaped terrain and nullified carefully prepared positions. Lieutenant Musashino Kikuzo, who commanded an infantry company in the central sector, later testified after capture that the continuous thunder of explosions for 3 days and nights created helplessness unknown elsewhere in the Pacific. The ground shook as if the island were being torn apart. Men in the deepest tunnels felt vibrations through solid rock and began to doubt that any position could truly protect them from the American fleet's seemingly inexhaustible supply. Effectiveness came from technology and tactic. American spotters pioneered methods to detect camouflaged positions through indirect indicators. They tracked footpaths worn into volcanic ash, noting where paths disappeared into apparently solid ground, then targeted those coordinates to collapse concealed entrances. They watched steam vents and noted pattern changes when underground chambers absorbed impacts. They used those signatures to map subterranean networks invisible to aerial photography. They studied terrain for shadows, inconsistent with natural rock formations, and identified false facings concealing firing ports. They also employed white phosphorus shells to mark targets with dense smoke visible for miles. This allowed multiple ships to concentrate fire against high-value positions. The tactic proved devastating against artillery attempting to engage the fleet. Heavy cruisers USS Pensacola, USS Salt Lake City, USS Chester, and USS Indianapolis provided critical intermediate firepower to complement battleships. Each heavy cruiser mounted 9 8-inch rifles firing 260-pound armor-piercing or high-explosive shells at up to 4 rounds per gun per minute. They provided rapid response. When Japanese artillery revealed positions by firing at spotters or ships, cruisers could blanket the area with dozens of 8-inch shells within minutes. They suppressed enemy fire while battleships maneuvered for heavier strikes. USS Pensacola distinguished herself on February 17th when she closed to within 4,000 yards of the western beaches. She deliberately drew fire from camouflaged positions to reveal them for targeting by other ships. Japanese gunners hit Pensacola 17 times with 120mm and 150mm shells, killing 17 sailors and wounding 98. Her sacrifice enabled spotters to identify 27 previously unknown artillery positions. Concentrated battleship fire subsequently destroyed them, eliminating guns that would have devastated landing craft. Light cruisers USS Birmingham, USS Santa Fe, and USS Biloxi, each with 12 or 15 6-inch guns, focused on smaller targets, machine gun nests, mortar positions, and troop concentrations identified by spotters. Their rapid-fire capability, reaching 10 rounds per gun per minute in maximum effort, was ideal for saturating areas where Japanese infantry assembled in reserve or moved through communication trenches. 12 destroyers rotated close-range missions, approaching within 2,000 yards of shore, to engage with 5-inch guns at nearly point-blank naval ranges. Accuracy was measured in feet, not yards, while accepting risk from coastal artillery. Destroyer USS Leutze absorbed multiple hits while providing direct fire that destroyed a command bunker on Mount Suribachi's northern face. Her 5-inch shells penetrated firing ports and detonated inside. This was precision gunnery enabled by radar fire control and skilled spotting. Intercepted Japanese communications revealed growing desperation as bombardment progressed. Messages decoded after the battle showed Kuribayashi reporting to Imperial General Headquarters that American naval gunfire exceeded all previous experience in duration and effectiveness. Positions considered secure were being systematically destroyed. Casualties mounted despite the garrison remaining largely underground. A decoded message dated February 18th noted that the situation is far more serious than anticipated and requested permission to reorganize based on reduced artillery capability. Another message intercepted on February 19th, hours before the assault, reported disrupted communications with forward units due to tunnel damage. Several battalion commanders had not reported for more than 12 hours, suggesting their command posts were destroyed or inaccessible. Ammunition expenditure during Pacific Thunder reflected a deliberate choice to trade shells for lives. Each 16-inch armor-piercing shell fired by USS Washington or USS North Carolina cost approximately $3,000 in 1945, roughly $50,000 in contemporary terms. High-capacity rounds cost approximately $2,000. 14-inch shells cost between $1,500 and $2,000. 8-inch cruiser rounds cost approximately $400. 5-inch destroyer ammunition cost roughly $35. Over 74 hours at Iwo Jima, the fleet expended approximately $45 million of ammunition in 1945 dollars, equivalent to nearly $750 million in contemporary value, against an island of 8 square miles defended by 21,000 troops. This expenditure reflected American philosophy. Prioritize firepower over manpower. Factories could produce shells indefinitely. Trained Marines and sailors were irreplaceable, and their lives justified the material cost. Logistics enabling this expenditure spanned thousands of miles across the Pacific. Ammunition ships including USS Rainier, USS Shasta, and USS Lassen accompanied the fleet. They carried thousands of tons of shells in climate-controlled magazines and transferred ammunition via highline, while steaming at 5 knots through ocean swells. These operations, conducted day and night, allowed battleships and cruisers to maintain fire without interruption. USS Tennessee took ammunition on 3 separate occasions during the 74-hour bombardment. She received more than 800 rounds of 14-inch shells, plus hundreds of 5-inch rounds. She maintained continuous fire support from February 16th through D-Day on February 19th. Efficiency was such that target availability, not ammunition supply, became the limiting factor. This reversed traditional siege warfare calculations. Japanese observers on nearby Chichi-jima recognized a transformation in naval warfare. Major Yoshitaka Hori later testified that sustained, precise bombardment showed that no fixed fortification could survive indefinitely when the fleet expended ammunition freely. His analysis, preserved in captured documents, noted that American doctrine treated naval ammunition as a renewable resource rather than a rationed asset. Technical precision combined with logistical abundance turned concrete and rock into temporary protection. He concluded that future Japanese defenses should assume preliminary bombardments would destroy most above-ground fortifications, regardless of construction quality. He recommended deep underground defenses with multiple alternate positions for post-bombardment movement. 3 days of bombardment reshaped Iwo Jima's landscape. Mount Suribachi's lower slopes, once covered in scrub and pockmarked with camouflaged bunkers, became a moonscape of overlapping craters. The earth was churned and pulverized by thousands of impacts. Aerial photographs before and after showed entire hillsides apparently rearranged. Explosions excavated tens of thousands of tons of rock and soil and redeposited them in new forms. Beaches designated for the landings, once flat approaches covered in volcanic ash and backed by terraced dunes with hidden positions, became crater fields. The artificial terrain sometimes provided more cover for attacking forces than the original ground. Japanese pillboxes that had been nearly invisible became obvious by their absence, marked by rectangular foundations of broken concrete and twisted reinforcing bars. The precision of American gunnery foreshadowed post-war developments in guided munitions and computerized fire control. USS Idaho achieved a measured accuracy of 70% hits within a 50-yard radius, at ranges exceeding 18,000 yards, while engaging targets on the northern plateau. Mark 8 radar tracked shells in flight and computed ballistic corrections for subsequent salvos. The feedback loop worked consistently. The first shell established baseline data, the second incorporated corrections, and the third achieved precise impact with high probability. Naval gunnery shifted from probabilistic area saturation to near certainty of target destruction given time and ammunition. Positions that might survive area fire faced virtual certainty of destruction under iterative precision. Many bunker-buster engagements required 10 or more salvos against individual targets as fire control teams walked shells onto coordinates until spotters confirmed destruction. 74 hours of continuous bombardment had measurable psychological effects. Marines landing on February 19th encountered fierce and determined resistance, aligned with Bushido tradition. Yet it was operationally disorganized compared with Kuribayashi's plan. Many artillery pieces that survived structurally were abandoned or unmanned. Crews were killed, concussed even in underground positions, or unable to reach guns through collapsed tunnels and destroyed communication trenches. Intelligence officers interrogated approximately 1,000 prisoners, most captured only after being too severely wounded to resist or commit suicide. Many spoke of the pre-landing bombardment with awe and fear. They described continuous explosions that made rational thought impossible and left them dazed and disoriented before the Marines even landed. At 9 a.m. on February 19, 1945, the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions stormed ashore under a protective umbrella of naval gunfire. Fire shifted seamlessly from pre-landing bombardment to direct close support. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that had spent 3 days destroying fixed positions now walked fire inland ahead of advancing troops at rates coordinated to the yard. Salvos landed 200 to 300 yards beyond the forward edge of Marine units. Fire adjusted as troops advanced, maintaining a rolling barrage that suppressed defenders and gave Marines critical moments to cross open ground and close with positions. USS Nevada, having expended more than 700 rounds of 14-inch ammunition against Suribachi during preliminary fire, continued throughout D-Day. Spotters coordinated with Sherman tanks and forward observers to target cave openings and reverse slope positions invisible from offshore. By nightfall, Marines carved out a beachhead 3,000 yards wide and up to 700 yards deep. It was shallower than hoped, but achieved against an enemy whose defenses were substantially weakened by the most intensive naval bombardment in the Pacific War. The 36-day battle for Iwo Jima cost 6,821 Americans killed and 19,217 wounded. Japanese losses reached 18,844 killed from a garrison of 21,000. These numbers demonstrated both the effectiveness of Pacific Thunder and the limits of naval gunfire against deep defenses. The 3-day bombardment achieved significant tactical results. It destroyed most artillery capable of engaging the beaches. It collapsed many above-ground fortifications and pillboxes. It severed communications between forward units and command posts. It inflicted hundreds of casualties before the landings. Post-battle assessments estimated that naval fire eliminated approximately 60% of Japanese artillery and perhaps 30 to to 40% of machine gun and infantry positions that were above ground or lightly protected. This degradation saved Marine lives during the critical first hours. The bombardment did not achieve complete destruction. Surviving positions were mostly in the deepest tunnels or reverse slope caves, inaccessible to flat trajectory naval fire. These positions inflicted the majority of American casualties during the ground campaign. Lieutenant General Holland Smith requested 10 days of preliminary bombardment, arguing that Iwo Jima's defensive density justified unprecedented preparation time. Admiral Raymond Spruance limited bombardment to 3 days due to operational requirements, including surprise, fuel, and the risk of kamikaze or submarine attack near the home islands. Subsequent casualty rates fueled debate about whether additional days would have reduced losses enough to justify the risks. Historians continue to debate the question without consensus. What is indisputable is that the 3-day bombardment marked a quantum evolution in American naval fire support. From early disasters at Tarawa, through refinements at Saipan and Peleliu, to the mature system at Iwo Jima, technology and tactics converged. Radar, proximity fuses, spotter coordination, sustained fire techniques, and logistics for at-sea replenishment created a capability that altered amphibious warfare's risk calculus. Japanese doctrine in 1944 assumed preliminary bombardments would last 2 to 4 days and focus on area targets. Pacific Thunder's 74-hour precision bombardment treated ammunition as expendable and accepted extended duration to achieve thorough destruction. Confidence in reinforced concrete and careful positioning, reasonable based on prior data, shattered under the weight of 38,000 shells totaling 14,000 tons against an 8-square-mile island, until above-ground positions were essentially confirmed destroyed by spotters. USS Nevada's role carried symbolic weight beyond tactics. The battleship sunk at Pearl Harbor returned to destroy Japanese fortifications with systematic precision. Navy public affairs and war correspondents emphasized the narrative. Nevada's participation, along with USS Tennessee, which had also been damaged at Pearl Harbor, underscored American industrial recovery. The temporary Japanese victory in December 1941 awakened an American capacity for industrial-scale warfare. By February 1945, the same nation that saw its Pacific Fleet crippled could sustain bombardments that expended millions of dollars of ammunition daily without strain on production or logistics. This validated pre-war assumptions about industrial capacity as the ultimate arbiter of protracted conflict. Kuribayashi survived the preliminary bombardment in his deep command post and died during the final counterattack in late March 1945. His documents and letters revealed a clear understanding of American material superiority, even as he prepared defenses to delay inevitable defeat. In a letter to his wife written weeks before the invasion and recovered after the battle, he acknowledged that American firepower exceeded anything Japan could match. His mission was not victory, which he considered impossible, but to inflict maximum casualties to discourage further American advances toward the home islands. His preparations, which still produced the highest casualty ratio of any Pacific amphibious assault, despite the devastating bombardment, represented the apex of Japanese defensive art against an enemy whose industrial and technological advantages made traditional calculations increasingly irrelevant. Lessons from Iwo Jima directly influenced Operation Iceberg, the assault on Okinawa in April 1945. Navy planners allocated 7 days of preliminary bombardment and expended even greater tonnages. Techniques refined at Iwo Jima proved crucial, marking cave openings with white phosphorus for subsequent high-explosive bombardment, systematically targeting reverse slope positions with plunging fire at maximum elevation, and sustaining long fire missions against single targets that required dozens of shells. 10 battleships, including British HMS King George III, expended more than 60,000 shells during 7 days of preliminary bombardment, plus countless thousands during the 82-day ground campaign. This scale dwarfed Iwo Jima and marked the peak of World War II naval gunfire. The ammunition expended at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, though extraordinary, represented a tiny fraction of American production in 1945. The United States produced approximately 41 billion rounds of small arms ammunition, 38 million artillery shells of all types, and 5.8 million tons of aerial bombs during World War II. Ammunition never constrained operations. The Army and Navy could afford to expend $45 million of naval shells over 3 days at Iwo Jima, because factories produced that quantity in less than 1 day of output. American industry could sustain such expenditures indefinitely across multiple theaters. Japan's industrial capacity could not. Japanese production totaled approximately 1.5 billion artillery shells during the entire war, roughly equivalent to 6 weeks of American peak production. Chronic shortages of explosives, propellants, and precision components persisted. Fire control sophistication at Iwo Jima culminated investments in radar, computing, and gunnery theory, dating to the 1930s. Mark 8 fire control radar tracked supersonic shells. Mark 1A mechanical fire control computers, weighing more than 5 tons and packed with precision gears and cams, computed ballistic solutions and corrections. Systems automatically generated corrected firing data that gun crews read off dials. This automation yielded accuracy comparable to aimed rifle fire at artillery scale. Successive shots reliably walked onto targets with minimal dispersion. Japanese naval artillery relied largely on optical rangefinders and manual calculation. Human error and time delays reduced accuracy. By 1945, the technical gap mirrored broader divergences across military systems. American investments in radar, computing, and electronics created force multipliers that offset numerical advantages elsewhere. Pacific Thunder foreshadowed post-war precision, the principle of tracking projectiles, extracting deviation data, and correcting subsequent rounds established the modern framework for artillery fire control. Digital sensors and solid-state computing would later replace analog radar and mechanical computers. Iwo Jima proved that precision through systematic correction can substitute for overwhelming volume when ammunition supply permits repeated engagements. This insight informed post-war doctrine and led to today's shoot-and-correct methodologies. For Japan, Iwo Jima confirmed the bleakest strategic assessments. Planning for homeland defense under Operation Ketsugo abandoned the belief that fortifications could survive prolonged bombardment. It emphasized dispersed positions, mobile reserves, and immediate counterattacks against landing forces before fire support could dismantle defensive networks. Recognition that no realistic fortification effort could withstand American willingness to expend ammunition on Iwo Jima's and Okinawa's scale contributed to strategic paralysis. Defensive doctrines that inflicted heavy casualties at Peleliu and Iwo Jima were temporary expedients, not sustainable solutions against an enemy with seemingly limitless resources and advancing technology. The human cost of Iwo Jima, with combined American and Japanese casualties exceeding 26,000 dead and 19,000 wounded from a total force of approximately 100,000, remains controversial among historians evaluating the island's strategic value. Iwo Jima provided emergency landing fields for damaged B-29 bombers returning from raids against Japan. More than 2,400 emergency landings occurred between March 1945 and the end of the war, potentially saving 24,000 aircrew members who might otherwise have ditched in the Pacific. The island also hosted P-51 Mustang fighters that escorted B-29s on later raids, improving survival and effectiveness. Whether those benefits justified 6,821 Americans killed involves strategic assessment, moral judgment, and counterfactual speculation. Debate continues. Pacific Thunder established precedents beyond World War II. During the Korean War, American battleships provided gunfire support along the coasts. USS Missouri, USS New Jersey, USS Wisconsin, and USS Iowa fired thousands of 16-inch shells against North Korean and Chinese positions. In the Vietnam War, USS New Jersey was reactivated for coastal fire support. Her 16-inch guns reached targets 23 miles inland and delivered devastating fire against Viet Cong positions and logistics routes. Naval gunfire retained utility where air superiority and logistics allowed capital ships to operate near hostile shores. The advent of anti-ship missiles and battleship retirement eventually ended this era. Naval artillery evolved from World War II's electromechanical fire control and optically tracked spotters, to helicopters in Korea, to radar-equipped spotters and early computerized fire control in Vietnam. This path led to modern weapons including Tomahawk cruise missiles. Tomahawks achieve the precision that Iwo Jima delivered through iterative correction, but they do it on the first round via GPS guidance and terrain matching. The principle remained constant. Apply overwhelming firepower with sufficient precision to destroy hardened targets while minimizing exposure of attacking forces. Pacific Thunder advanced that principle in 1945. The economic trade, expensive munitions for reduced casualties, became standard doctrine as personnel costs rose relative to weapon costs. Modern militaries often expend million-dollar precision weapons to avoid ground casualties. USS Nevada, present at both Pearl Harbor's destruction and Iwo Jima's conquest, bookended American naval experience in the Pacific War. She concluded service as a target ship in the 1946 atomic tests at Bikini Atoll. She survived both the Able air burst and the Baker underwater detonation. She was too radioactive for further use and was ultimately sunk as a target in 1948. Her career spanned commissioning in 1916, World War I service, interwar modernization, damage at Pearl Harbor, resurrection and modernization, bombardment duties at Normandy, and finally Iwo Jima and Okinawa before nuclear testing and final sinking. Her journey from victim at Pearl Harbor to bombardment platform at Iwo Jima encapsulated American naval evolution across 3 decades and 2 world wars. It resonated symbolically as a story of recovery from catastrophic surprise to overwhelming victory. Japanese defenders at Iwo Jima were nearly annihilated. Approximately 3% survived to captivity. Their documents and testimony showed they understood American material superiority intellectually, but failed to grasp its operational implications until they experienced Pacific Thunder. The gap between abstract knowledge and visceral comprehension characterized Japanese miscalculation throughout the Pacific War. Knowing that American industry could produce more ships, aircraft, and ammunition did not translate into appreciating that Americans would expend ammunition on scales the Japanese considered wasteful and sustain it indefinitely. When 38,000 shells fell over 74 hours on a single small island, that reality broke morale and contributed to fatalism that marked Japanese defense in 1945. Comparing Japanese and American approaches reveals different philosophies shaped by resources and strategy. Japanese forces, constrained by shortages and limited industry, emphasized robust fortifications to survive limited enemy fire, ammunition conservation, and acceptance of higher casualties to preserve materiel. American forces, backed by overwhelming production and global logistics, emphasized lavish expenditure of materiel to minimize casualties. They overwhelmed defenses with volume and precision and treated ammunition as renewable, while considering trained personnel irreplaceable. These approaches reflected different strategic situations and cultural values regarding human life versus materiel. The contrast remains relevant to contemporary military ethics and planning. The 3-day bombardment showed that confidence in static fortifications cannot survive against an enemy willing and able to sustain precise, overwhelming fire. Japanese commanders learned that no fortification could withstand indefinite bombardment when the attacker possessed enough ammunition and precision to retarget the same positions until destruction was confirmed. This lesson, purchased with more than 20,000 Japanese lives at Iwo Jima, revealed the obsolescence of traditional fortification doctrine in industrial warfare. Material abundance and technical precision rendered static defenses eventually indefensible against enemies who possessed both. Pacific Thunder's legacy extends beyond immediate tactics and operations. It influenced modern doctrine for fire support, the relationship between precision and volume in artillery effects, and the strategic implications of industrial capacity converted into combat power. Modern American doctrine emphasizes joint fires that integrate naval gunfire, Army and Marine artillery, close air support, drones, and loitering munitions. These are coordinated through digital networks that provide real-time targeting and battle damage assessment. The emphasis on overwhelming, precisely coordinated fires that destroy enemy capabilities before friendly ground forces close with them traces directly to Pacific amphibious operations culminating in Iwo Jima. The principle remains foundational. Accept extended preparation time and expend large quantities of munitions. If doing so, reduces casualties. The enabling investments, radar fire control, mechanical computing, radio communications, linking spotters and firing platforms, and underway replenishment were cutting edge in the mid-1940s. They established capability requirements that drove later development. Mark 8. Radar's ability to track shells and compute corrections anticipated modern systems that use GPS, inertial navigation, and digital computing for first-round precision. Close coordination between gunfire and spotter aircraft prefigured modern joint fires where forward air controllers, forward observers, and fires coordination centers integrate across services. Logistics for sustained bombardment through underway ammunition transfer demonstrated the critical role of combat service support in maintaining tempo. This insight shaped doctrine emphasizing forward support and rapid resupply in later conflicts. For historians and strategists, Iwo Jima's bombardment is a case study in how tactical preparation influences operational success. The 3-day bombardment degraded defenses significantly, but fell short of complete destruction, contributing to high ground combat casualties. The gap between expected and achieved effects prompted debates about optimal bombardment duration, target priorities, and damage assessment accuracy. These questions remain relevant for planning modern forcible entry operations. Whether additional days would have reduced Marine casualties enough to justify greater fleet risk cannot be answered definitively, but the analysis remains valuable for future contested littoral scenarios. Human experience underpinned technical performance. American gun crews worked in controlled chaos inside battleship turrets. Each 16-inch shot created overpressure that demanded careful ventilation timing. Heat required cooling delays. Mechanical stress required constant maintenance between missions. Crews sustained operations for 3 days with minimal sleep, working in confined spaces filled with propellant smoke despite ventilation, manhandling shells and powder bags weighing hundreds of pounds, and maintaining precision despite fatigue. USS Tennessee's crew, firing more than 1,300 rounds, performed more than 5,000 individual shell loadings, each requiring coordinated effort and precise sequence. Technical capability demanded sustained human effort to produce combat effects. Japanese defenders endured trauma that persisted for decades. Testimony from the small number of prisoners revealed disorientation, temporary deafness, and inability to maintain cohesion as commanders and subordinates were isolated by collapsed tunnels. Many experienced a pervasive sense of futility against an enemy with limitless capabilities. Kuribayashi avoided direct engagement on the beaches and planned to fight inland. He recognized that shore positions would be completely destroyed by naval gunfire. He aimed to draw American forces beyond effective naval gun range before decisive engagement. The adaptation was sophisticated. It delayed defeat but did not prevent it. Naval gunfire, Marine artillery brought ashore, and close air support maintained American fire superiority throughout the campaign. Iwo Jima's strategic significance must be viewed within the broader American plan to defeat Japan. That plan centered on strategic bombing of the home islands to destroy industry and morale, while establishing forward bases for an eventual invasion if Japan refused to surrender. Iwo Jima provided emergency landing fields and fighter escort bases that enhanced bombing effectiveness. The campaign could have continued from Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, but with higher losses and reduced effectiveness. Planners judged that capturing Iwo Jima would save aircrew lives. They could not foresee that Japan would surrender after atomic bombs, potentially reducing the island's long-term strategic value. The intersection of industrial intensity and human consequence reveals the nature of warfare as organized violence that requires extraordinary effort regardless of technology. Industrial production becomes combat effects. Steel becomes battleships whose guns fire shells filled with explosives to destroy fortifications built with concrete and steel. By 1945, warfare was an industrial and organizational contest. Yet the human element remained central. Material superiority is necessary, but not sufficient. It requires trained people willing to employ capabilities under combat conditions. The story of Pacific Thunder captures an essential truth. American industrial capacity, applied with technical precision through evolved doctrine, achieved effects that exceeded Japanese defensive calculations based on prior battles. Japanese confidence in concrete and engineered defenses was reasonable, given earlier data. It failed to account for American adaptation that accepted days, not hours, to achieve thorough destruction of modern fortifications. When 16-inch shells delivering more than 100 million foot-pounds of kinetic energy struck repeatedly over 74 hours, guided by radar and spotter aircraft, even the best engineered fortifications collapsed. American fire support doctrine was validated. Japanese defensive calculations proved tragically optimistic. In industrial-age warfare between opponents with vastly different productive capacity, the side with material abundance and technical sophistication can reshape terrain and destroy fortifications through sustained firepower. Static defense becomes futile against an enemy willing to expend ammunition without constraint and able to sustain that expenditure indefinitely through superior logistics.